We are going to now talk about the different things that need to be in your picture to determine if it is a rectangle, rhombus, or square. So first off, for a rectangle, we need to make sure that one angle of a parallelogram is a right angle. If that is the case, then it is a rectangle. Second one is if the diagonals of a parallelogram are congruent, then you have enough information to say that it is a rectangle. Now notice, they both have to be a parallelogram before you can determine if it's a rectangle. So if it's not a parallelogram, then you do not have enough information for the rectangle. Next up is a rhombus. So also we have to know first that it's a parallelogram, and then we also have to know that one pair of consecutive sides is going to be congruent. For the second one, we need to know it's a parallelogram first, and then the diagonals need to be perpendicular to each other. The third reason is if it's a parallelogram first, then we need to make sure it has one diagonal that bisects a pair of opposite angles, and then that is enough information to say it is a rhombus. If you look at the different pictures that go along with each of those statements, you can see all the different measurements that you need to see in your picture. To prove that it is a square, first of all, you have to make sure that it is a rectangle, and it also has to be a rhombus. So you need to make sure that you have at least one of those conditions for each of those types of parallelograms before you can say it's a square. So if it's only a rectangle, then it cannot be a square. And if it's only a rhombus, then it cannot be a square. So it has to have rectangle and rhombus characteristics for it to be a square. This little fill in the box is a way to check to see if you really understand what we just talked about. So if it is a parallelogram, or if the parallelogram has one of these characteristics, then the parallelogram is considered what type of shape? So for the first one, if the parallelogram has one right angle, then your shape is a rectangle. The only other thing that we have to know to make sure it is a rectangle is that we have to have congruent diagonals. On this third one, I want you to fill in the missing type of parallelogram. So if you have the parallelogram and it is one pair of consecutive sides are congruent, then what is that called? You should have chosen that it is a rhombus. On to the next one. So this one is a little bit tricky, so actually if we fill out the last one first, then we can figure out what the third characteristic is that we haven't talked about yet. So on the very last one, if we have one diagonal that bisects a pair of opposite sides, this is also a rhombus. So there's three things mentioned up above that causes us to say that it is going to be a rhombus, and the part that is missing is that we need perpendicular diagonals. So the diagonals are going to be perpendicular to each other, which means they're going to be 90 degrees in the middle part of those triangles. Remember, if we need to determine if this quadrilateral is a rectangle, rhombus, or square, it first needs to be a parallelogram. If it is not a parallelogram, then we do not have enough information to say that it will be one of these three specific types. For letter A, because we have a pair of opposite sides that are congruent, and you have another pair of opposite sides that are congruent, it is a parallelogram. So then we can note that there are four congruent sides. So not only are just the opposite sides congruent, but all four of them are going to be congruent. We don't know anything about the angles, so the only thing that we can say is that it will be a rhombus. And we've seen this one similar before, and you're going to see this one often. On to letter B. So on this one, all we know is that AC is equal to BD. To be a parallelogram, we would have to know that the diagonals bisect each other, but that doesn't tell us anything in this picture. We cannot see if the diagonals bisect each other. We also would have to know something about maybe one of the sides, if they're parallel or if they're congruent to each other, but all we have is that the two diagonals are congruent. So we do not have enough information to even say it's a parallelogram, so this is none of them. Remember, we would need to know that the diagonals are bisecting each other, and we don't know that, so that's why we can't say it's a parallelogram. So letter C, it says it's a parallelogram, so the piece that we have these consecutive sides are congruent to each other. So knowing that, I want you to fill in what type of parallelogram this will be. If you look up in our chart, right above this, we have it mentioned right here that one pair of consecutive sides, if they are congruent, that it is a rhombus. So your answer should be rhombus, just like up there. Some of the questions in your assignments will be, if you see a picture and you need to first see, is the conclusion or is the statement that they give us true or false? So is this shape right here, is it a square? If it's not a square, then you need to tell me one other piece of information that I would need to know so that I could make it so it is a square. So first off, we need to look at our picture, and all I see is that we have 4 congruent sides. If all that we know that there is just 4 congruent sides, so far we have a rhombus. But remember, if we need it to be a square, it also needs to be a rectangle. But we do not know anything about the diagonals, or if the sides are parallel to each other, or anything else that would make it a rectangle. So we need some type of property of a rectangle to show that this is going to be a square, because if we say it's a rectangle, and we've already explained that it's a rhombus, then it will be a square as well. One property we could say is that the diagonals need to be congruent to each other. In our picture, that would be QS is congruent to PR. Another characteristic or property that we could say is that we just need one of the angles to be a right angle. So for example, in our picture, QPS, so one of these a right angle right there in the corner. So not one of the interior ones on the very inside right here, but on the edges of our 4 corners of our shape. So if we have one of these properties would be true, then it would also be a rectangle. So then if it's a rhombus and a rectangle, then that would make it a square in the end.